I am Kori Schake, the Deputy Director General of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and I am thrilled to see so many of you turn out today for the release of this terrific publication, the culmination of a year's work by our Conflict Security and Development Program. The IISS produces independent, policy-relevant data and analysis on conflicts, however caused, that may have an important military dimension. And we continuously collect and analyze data on 173 countries. We do that in a variety of media and forums. The Military Balance Plus is our digital database that allows users to produce bespoke graphics and use advanced analytic tools to assess that data across 173 countries. We are beginning now to wrestle with the challenge of how do we measure offensive cyber power, and we have the ambition to incorporate that into the military balance assessments. The Conflict Security and Development Program assembles in one place information needed to appreciate factors that affect conflict and post-conflict stabilization, and it is their outstanding work we are here this morning to talk about. The Armed Conflict Database is, we are refining and further developing into, well, we're going to talk about that at length. We are aspiring to produce data across the entire spectrum of conflict. And the Armed Conflict Database, we are, as part of our 60th anniversary research and development appeal, are instrumentalizing in new and different ways and thinking our way through that particular problem. What we are talking about specifically this morning is the Armed Conflict Survey, which assesses 33 conflicts across 6 different regions of the world. It looks at key developments and in particularly the military implications of the driving dynamics of these different conflicts. We have started transforming both the structure and the format of the book this year. So we would love to hear your feedback on what works for you, what doesn't work for you. This year we are looking at the detailed information about parties to the conflict, non-state actors, and the conflict, and deriving from that information conflict-specific maps. We are aspiring to make this reader-friendly and to make the visuals ways that invite readers into a better understanding of the dynamics of the specific conflicts. This year's book has 70 different full-color maps, tables, and infographics, and we have gathered here this morning 2 of the stellar team of senior analysts of this organization, Virginia Comolli, who runs the Conflict Security and Development Program, and Francesca Grandi, who is the editor of the Armed Conflict Survey. And so we are going to have a conversation about this year's book and invite you into that conversation this morning. I want to start by asking both of you to identify what you think the big trend is in armed conflict. Are they increasing in number and severity, decreasing? What's staying the same? Virginia, let's start with you.
Yes, thank you very much, Kori. And it's such a pleasure to finally have reached launch day. So much work, as you said, has gone into this year book, and I'm very pleased that many of the contributors are actually here with us in the room. So it's a chance for you all to meet them. I will introduce them later, and also there's a chance for us to thank them for their very hard work. You ask a very interesting question, because is the conflict increasing, decreasing? You know, it really depends on the way we measure it. If we just look at numbers, so if we take last year's edition of the Armed Conflict Survey, we did have 36 conflicts. If you look at this year's edition, we only have 33. So you might be wondering, is the world becoming more peaceful? Well, it depends on the methodology that you are applying. We are constantly reviewing our approach because conflict is constantly evolving and changing, and we need to keep abreast with those changes. And so in this year's review of what's happening around the world, we looked in more details at those dynamics, and we decided, for instance, in the case of Colombia, to actually combine the conflicts that we have, and instead of having the ELN as a separate conflict and the BACRIM, so the criminal bands also an independent conflict, we realized that actually, although the ELN conflict has started from an ideological point of view, has over time evolved to become almost exclusively criminally driven conflict, which merits to be included in the broader criminal conflict that we look at in Colombia.
By analyzing the conflicts over last year, we learned that there were three major trends that we could extrapolate from the conflict reports that we produced. And so the first that we observed is that local dynamics are very much affected by global trends, like climate change, for example, but also by transnational networks and interventions. The second trend that we observe is that civilians have been victimized. Of course, as we know, in contemporary conflicts, civilians take the brunt of the violence in our conflict, but the ways they've been victimized, we have observed, are sort of expanding. So we have observed record level of displacement across the globe, especially in the Middle East and in Africa. And the third trend that we observed is what Virginia was referring to, which is that criminal organizations are becoming more and more prominent in conflicts today, but also the criminal motivation and drivers of organizations that didn't necessarily started out as criminal are also increasing.
Excellent. My favorite part of the book is the specific country chapters. Mm-hmm. And so I want to ask you, in particular, give us an example from one of those that shows how the assessments explain the dynamics of conflict in the country.
Absolutely. Actually, I can do that by showing you a picture. So this is one of the maps that we included in each conflict in the book has a map, because we believe that actually giving a map gives a mental map to the reader on what the drivers are. And this is Colombia, of course, as you can tell. And what we are portraying here is that the drug trade and the drug production is a major driver of the conflict. And so we put it on a map to match the areas where most violence happen, but also the area where most coca is produced. And of course, there is an overlap between the two.
Mm-hmm. And talk about how the different dynamics, the major trends, carry across different cases. Are there others that you think are particularly resonant in?
The global trends, absolutely. So climate change is certainly one that we recognize as being extremely important, because it has not direct effects across the globe, but indirect effects in exacerbating conflicts. But it does that in many different ways. So, for example, in Afghanistan, there was one of the biggest droughts in history last year, and that, of course, threatened livelihood and crops, and so creates the potential for food insecurity, but also a people movement, because migration is a coping mechanism for scarcity of livelihoods. But then in sub-Saharan Africa, we see more desertification, and which leads to more competition over water resources, for example, and then feeds into underlying tensions between pastoralists and farmers who compete for the control of the land and grazing and crop land.
So, Virginia, criminal activity fueling and feeding conflict is an area of your research. Can I ask you to talk a little bit more about that and what you see in the emerging from the country chapters,
Yes.
that the conflict chapters that this year's book explores?
Yeah, I find the relationship between conflict and crime or organized crime or illicit economies fascinating, because crime has a significant role to play in the lead up to a conflict, because it contributes to those structural fragilities that make the start of a conflict, well, they contribute to the start of a conflict sometimes. During a conflict, criminal activities often through criminal activities, parties to the conflict can sustain their own operations, and also by doing so, criminal markets actually extend and prolong the duration of a conflict. And also in a post-conflict situations, of course, we've seen in a number of conflicts how criminal economies undermine the establishment of a strong licit economy, and also traditional or state-driven governance systems. With regard to specific cases in the book, I think the Sahel and the Mali-Sahel conflict is a very clear example of how illicit economies, criminal activities, both at the local level and also transnational and more organized ones, overlap with criminal dynamics. And we often hear about how the drugs trade has been overlapping with jihadis or other ideologically driven movements, but also other forms of criminality such as kidnap for ransom, for instance, or extortions have been used quite extensively by conflict parties in some of these conflicts. And that also raises, among other issues, raises some very interesting questions for the researchers. So what lens should be used to analyze these conflicts? So are we looking at conflicts through a political lens, or are we looking at conflicts to an economic, a criminal lens? And oftentimes we realize that we need to use both, and that's quite challenging in itself. But also this poses challenges for those who have to come up with responses to those challenges. For instance, are we using a counterinsurgency approach? Are we using a counter-narcotics approach? Or perhaps we should use a public health approach in some cases, for instance, when drug trade also turns into increased levels of drug consumptions in some of these conflict regions that are affected by this form of criminality.
Excellent.
Another very good example is the Central African Republic, because the conflict started the present conflict started in 2013, is mostly based on identity and political grievances. But with the time, it became a conflict very much entrenched in the control of lands outside the capital, from which the armed groups can extract taxation, they can extract the ability to exploit natural resources, and they control, most importantly, the routes throughout the country that are needed for very vital trade, but also for illicit trafficking. So it's a country that I follow quite closely, and this is one of the major challenges of the peace agreement that was signed in February, because the peace agreement addressed mostly issues of contest between political elites, but does not much to actually address the war-driven and the violence-driven political economy outside the capital, Bangui.
Virginia, since you run the program writ large, can you say a little bit about what, looking across these 33 conflicts, what you think the most important elements for stabilization are? What are the dynamics that produce stabilization that would make a case like the Central African Republic, where there is a peace agreement, but that agreement doesn't encompass all elements of localized conflicts? What are the big geopolitical factors you see that create stabilization or that enable stabilization?
Yeah. Well, I think that Yes, sorry. The stabilization toolkit needs to be very wide and broad, because as I in a way touched upon when I was talking about responses to these conflicts that are highly criminalized, you need the security, defense responses, but also you need to invest in local licit economies, so that people they divert their attention efforts away from illicit economies. You also need development and aid, and for instance, more investments in education, to mention one thing that I'm very passionate about, and we've seen especially across Africa how, and not only in Africa, but especially in Africa, and how these conflicts had an impact on kids' ability to go to school, because it's no longer safe to do so. Just recently, I was reading about developments in Burkina Faso. Some of those developments are included in our coverage of the Mali-Sahel conflict, but we are actually assessing whether the situation merits its own conflict. And one of the interesting statistics that I came across is that thousands and thousands of kids have been unable, because of the conflict, to go to school for several months. And in a country where just over 50% of kids complete primary education, you can immediately see how this kind of situation will have an impact on the social capital of countries that are already very much fragile. So just to summarize, I think the combination of security, defense, and diplomatic efforts with more on-the-ground interventions that actually strengthen the overall infrastructure of a country and make possible for civilians to actually build a future beyond conflict and fragility.
And here, for example, we can also see the impact of more global trends. For example, if we go back to the idea of climate change impacting how arable lands are retrenching, many post-conflict peace-building programs rely on creating jobs in the agricultural sector, but rural society end up being much more fragile to the desertification process, for example, because these jobs actually might not exist anymore, even though we are trying to figure out projects to actually create them.
And if I also can add on this, and also we are talking about, I would encourage people to talk about responses at different levels, which should run in parallel. One of the things that we highlight in this year...
Say more about what you mean about responses at different levels.
Yes, because one of the things that we highlight in this year Armed Conflict Survey is the expansion of conflict into cities, something that our colleague Antonio Sampaio has been leading on. And it is apparent that because of the peculiarity of cities and large urban centers in fragile and conflict affected regions, there is an argument to be made in terms of developing responses at the municipal, at the local level, that run in parallel with nationwide responses, and so in a way kind of devolving more power to mayors of some cities, mega cities in particular around the world, to actually tackle those peculiar security challenges that they face.
So one of the policy challenges associated with armed conflicts is that it's very difficult to get policymakers to pay attention, and the early stages where preventative involvement can be most cost-effective and most useful. And one of the things I really like about this year's book is that you, in the design of it and the execution of it, you have tried to emphasize the accessibility of the information. And I think that has an important consequence, which is if we can the temptation by busy policymakers with lots of demands on them is to say, this is too complicated. Come back when there's something I can do or have to do about it. How are you restructuring the database and the book to make the information more accessible?
Absolutely, thank you for that. Yes, that's something we really thought hard and long about, because we wanted a book that works as a reference in which it's easy to find the information, and it's also easy to connect the information to more general conceptual points that can explain conflict. And so we decided to have the same template for each conflict report, which is a fairly easy one. There is a background that highlights the historical roots of the conflict, and then we give a snapshot of the year prior, because given the format of the publication, we do analyze conflict year by year. And then we focus on the conflict parties. And in many conflicts that we analyze here, the conflict parties are non-state armed groups. And so we go through their structure, their motivations, their strategies, their leadership, to give a better sense of how these entities operate, which is of course very different than a regular military. And so those differences are very important to highlight, because then we should expect very different behavior and incentives. And then we have a part that discusses the political and military development of the year prior. And then we discuss what how the conflict has had an effect on the country as a whole, or the people who are involved. So we are looking at the humanitarian consequences, we are looking at the economic consequences of the conflict, and then we end with a perspective on what we think are the things that we should keep an eye on going forward, both in the short term and in the medium term.
One of the challenges analytically in this space is what counts as conflict. How do you define conflict? What is it? How do you get your hands around what is a very obtuse concept for many, and how do you create the boundaries of it? What's the definition? How do you apply it?
You created it.
Well, no, I was involved with a team of colleagues in a rather long and very rigorous process over the past couple of years that led to the definition that we have today, according to which a conflict in the Armed Conflict Database and Armed Conflict Survey is an armed contestation between two or more actors, being state or non-state, that are organized and they make purposive use of violence in a sustained way. And so oftentimes we are asked, well, why don't you include Venezuela? Why don't you include another? There are different situations that are happening in the world that are crises, and they make headlines. But we always have to go back to our definition, because it's very important for us to take the most rigorous approach possible and only include conflicts that actually meet all these different requirements.
So why doesn't Venezuela meet?
Yeah.
Which of those criteria does Venezuela not get to?
Yes. One of a very important criteria has to do with organization of the conflict parties. And we assess that the civilian groups that are at the receiving end of government repression are not sufficiently organized to actually meet our criteria. However, we are not totally oblivious to what is happening in Venezuela. One, because we keep on monitoring the situation as it evolves, because we will every year we add or remove conflicts, because it's a very fluid process as developments occur. But we are also, because we are mindful of the humanitarian repercussions of the crisis in Venezuela and the outflow of refugees that from Venezuela seek safety in Colombia.
Excellent. So one of the big improvements in the book this year is in the visualization of the complex data that it's accruing and assessing. And for those of you who listen to our IISS podcast, Sound Strategic, the one question I always ask everybody is, what is your favorite data visualization? And so I would like you, Francesca, to give us a couple, maybe one or two examples of what you think the interesting data visualizations in the book are.
Of course, and I will do that by first mentioning John Buck, who is sitting here in the first row, who is the master of our data visualization.
Yay, John!
I just show you a couple of examples. This is South Sudan, and here we decided to highlight where some of the major armed groups are present and overlap the information with the number of defection from the different armed groups that have occurred, because in the chapter we explain that defections and the control of the land are very important drivers of the dynamics of violence. We also have tables. For example, this is Afghanistan and the relative growth of commandos versus the regular forces. We have infographics of this kind which summarize the campaign for presidential elections in Egypt by listing the candidates and their background and how the election, what the result of the elections were. This is a fantastic infographic that Umberto, who I think is here there he is, Umberto Profazio did.
Well done.
So this is a very strong attempt, I would say, a very good one, to map the relationship between actors in Libya, which is notoriously a very different conflict in which to understand who is allied to whom and who is opposing whom. And just to finish, an even more complicated graph to show the very different actors active in Yemen and how they are opposed or allied or simply competing.
Excellent. Before we open up to questions, Virginia, do you want to introduce the contributors who are with us to help people target for future expertise?
Absolutely. As I said earlier, this has been a huge team effort. We've listed many of the people that have contributed to the book. And I'm also very pleased that in the first couple of rows, we have a number of colleagues from the Conflict Security and Development Program and others that have contributed, but also will be able to answer any specific questions you will have. So if you're interested in Sub-Saharan Africa, Andrew Chi, Eleanor Beaver, Flor Berger, and Nina Pauls will be your people. Middle East, of course, Emilio Kayem, Dia Muzin, and Zainab Olyabek. Latin America, Antonio Sampaio. South Asia, Antoine Levesque, Viraj Solanki, and Nick Crawford. And Europe and former Soviet Union, Nick Redman. And also we have colleagues from our defense team, Ben Barry, James Hackett, Maya Novens. I know also Lucy Berosidro is also in the room, and some others. So please, you guys please make yourselves known during the mingling session. But please, every one of you, if you would like to have more in-depth conversations afterwards, these are the people that you should go to. And again, I really like to thank everyone for their very strong contribution this year.
Excellent. So we have a full house here at Arundel House this morning. Anybody have questions you would like to ask? Either these two sharpshooters or the country experts?
Thank you. James Denslow from Save the Children. Francesca identified the trend towards greater civilian victimization, and I'm sure all of us will know that next week is the 20th anniversary of Security Council Resolution 1265 around protection of civilians. The UK is currently reviewing its protection of civilian strategy. I wondered how you hope the survey will engage policymakers in that regard, going back to Kori's point of having zero conflicts one day in it.
Thank you. The way we hope the publication would help policymakers to understand civilian victimization better is by showing the drivers of conflict in each situation and how they change. So, for example, in Syria, the targeting of civilians was clearly a strategy of the government to debilitate the opposition and to empty the territories controlled by the opposition of the the support of the civilians. In other conflicts, the same strategy of weakening the adversary happens in different ways, but very often civilians are targeted because their purposes. Like, for example, in South Sudan, civilians are targeted because they do belong to different identities. And so we believe that by identifying and analyzing those drivers in more details, we offer tools on how to counter those strategies, which hopefully might end up in designing more tailored approaches to the protection of civilians.
So one of my very favorite things about this magnificent institution is just how rigorous our internal debates are on important elements of conflict and security. And one of the arguments I have been having with Francesca is, what is new about this, right? Because the targeting of civilians has been an element, a strategy in war forever. Why is this new? What's new about it? How does it, how do we get our hands around policy relevant aspects of this? And to take the Syria case, and Emil knows this so much better than I, so please correct me if you think I'm going astray. It was not only a central element of the Assad regime's strategy, it was a central element of the Russian strategy, right? So the follow-ups of bombing hospitals after chemical weapons use, so you didn't have evidence of victims. That strikes me not as a new element of warfare, but something that not intervening in conflicts to enforce the many international conventions in which very many countries, mine and yours included, commit to protecting civilians in warfare. So there seem to me a whole lot of tools that our governments are choosing not to employ. And it's not the lack of tools, it's the lack of willingness to engage in the enforcement of the norms and standards that we would like to see in the international order. So after stomping on heavily on that issue, would anyone else like to ask a question? Yes, ma'am, middle of the fourth row. Did you want to comment on this specifically? Okay.
Abigail Watson, the Oxford Research Group. I'm interested in how the rise of Haftar in Libya and the protests in majority Arab areas now ruled by the SDF, what that tells us about the limits of Western states emboldening local groups to do the bulk of the frontline fighting, and what lessons what that has for the drivers of conflict and how states like the UK and the US should act in the future.
It's a great question.
Yeah, I would like to actually ask Umberto and Ben to intervene on this, please. Ben, would you like to start?
There are those in the UK and
Introduce yourself, please,
Sorry,
Ben.
I'm Ben Barry. I'm the Senior Fellow for Land Warfare in the Defence and Military Analysis team. There are those in the United States and UK who are rather pleased after the problematic outcomes of Iraq and Afghanistan in their current approach of by, through and with, working through military advisors and special forces. Well, Libya exposes the limitations of this, and the problems in the sector of Syria that's occupied by the SDF exposes that there's limitations on doing this if it's not in conjunction with a realistic and sensible political strategy. I'd also say that the coverage of Afghanistan in the Armed Conflict Survey makes it clear that the US-led approach to buy through with since 2014 has only partially succeeded, which is one of the reasons for the very difficult situation the Afghan government forces find themselves in. There is, however, a different perspective, which is from the dark side, which is both Russia and Iran would argue that in Syria, their approach to buy, through and with, which is distinguished by being much more ruthless, has succeeded, which rather links to the point Kori made earlier.
We got the rise of Haftar. I think it's caused by the ambivalence of the Western world and the confusion that caused it. In particular, France had a role. We had seen that in different episodes. The last one was the security guards that had been stopped at the Tunisian border with Libya a few weeks ago, and they were accused of supporting the LNSA offensive on Tripoli in the recent weeks. There is also a lot to say about the role of Italy. Of course, it is considered close to the government of national accord, but the prime minister right now says that he has better contact with Haftar than with Fayez al-Sarraj. And in general, we can say that the rise of Haftar is also due to the Egyptian model that is looking to it, is looking to Sisi as a model. He never hide it, and this is the result that we are seeing in this couple of days and weeks.
Thanks very much. Nigel Linkster.
Yeah, thanks very much. Nigel Linkster, Senior Advisor at IISS and actually the editor of the first ever edition of this publication. I'm delighted to see how much things have improved since my day, and they really have. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask a question to both the speakers and anyone else who would care to comment on what, if any, difference the existence of modern communications and social media make to the way conflicts are shaped and conducted. If one thinks back to the 1980s, the Hama massacre in Syria, basically a massacre of an entire urban population. Nobody knew anything about it. Now, somebody lets off a firecracker in the Central African Republic and the world is instantly aware of the fact. Does this make any material difference to the way conflict evolve and are conducted?
Thank you.
Virginia,
Sure.
fire away.
Absolutely, and thank you, Nigel. I think we've seen it in a number of conflicts, and I will focus primarily on the African context. How social media and mobile communication have indeed been factors in how we reach information or we obtain information about conflict. Although it also generates lots of noise, so we are submerged with information, and it's our job as analysts to actually try to cross-reference. So this huge amount of data, and I'm sure the colleagues in the defense team will sympathize with this huge challenge. Of course, in places such as okay, let me take a step back. We often talk about the internet and increase coverage across the African continent, but of course there are different degrees of internet penetration depending on the conflict, on the country you're in, and also depending on the region within a country you are in. So for instance, in the Lake Chad basin conflict, perhaps it's not the internet, but it's more like basic mobile communication that is being used extensively by non-state actors to coordinate their attacks. And this is something that local armed forces have clearly picked up upon. So there have been phases of the conflict in which mobile communication must have been basically switched off to prevent militants from coordinating their attacks. Of course, this also has some negative implications because it means that the civilians who are stuck in those conflict regions find it hard to seek help and communicate with the outside world, and also has an impact on the ability of the journalists who are there, who find it hard to cover the conflict, and so it becomes even harder for us sometimes to obtain information about those conflicts.
I completely agree with Virginia that more information is not necessarily what is gonna change things, because it really depends how that information is received and used. At the same time, I also think there is not there is not a very clear understanding of what the implications for the dynamics of a conflict are when social media are used to spread information, because there are some examples in which the shutdown of internet or social media have actually caused more violence. So for example, a former colleague was doing a research on the Arab Spring and the mobilization in El Cairo, and what his research showed is that the protests started to become much more massive after Facebook was actually shut down. And so I thought that was very interesting, because it's a very counterintuitive finding. Another example I can give is a country I follow more closely, which is Cameroon, in which a very similar story as in many other countries has happened since 2016, where very peaceful protests organized by unions and students and teachers and lawyers have actually been encountered with violent repression from the government. One of the tools of this repression has been the shutdown of internet in the regions where the protests were happening in the southwest of the country. But actually, we observed the military mobilization and the emergence of more organized armed groups after the internet was shut down. So I think these are very interesting counterfactual for when we think about how the internet and social media operate onto the dynamics of conflict.
Next question on the aisle here.
Hi. Good morning. I'm Ben Knobloch. I'm an independent researcher and stabilization practitioner. Thank you for the hors d'oeuvre on the book. Sounds fascinating. You covered stabilization in some context and the essential need for security, but security is a bit of a holy grail. We've just been talking, Ben was responding on the difficulties of by, with and through in the absence of a political strategy. We know that the actors on the ground are always difficult. So I'm curious, looking at the spread of conflicts you've looked at there, have you come up with any good examples of how local security to facilitate stabilization can be kicked off in the first instance, and how we then take that forward?
It's an outstanding question.
I will start answering by looking at one of the countries I follow, which is Central African Republic, in which there's been very good steps in terms of pacifying communities by relying on traditional structures of community resilience. So by which I mean that former leaders of communities have been empowered through the dialogue with international interveners like the UN and the Stabilization mission there, which has operated very localized and very specific project of dialogue and ad hoc ceasefire pacts and peace-building projects by bringing together communities that have been separated by the conflict. And across the country, these very micro-level projects have encountered much success. Then, of course, the next step is the challenge is to understand how to scale up these interventions. And here, of course, we get immediately into the realm of the political buy-in from both the national government, but also from the donors, which are not always coordinated and in agreement on how to address these challenges.
Jonathan, in the front row.
Yeah, this is a question. Jonathan Paris, security analyst. This question is much to Kori as to the two of you. I notice a lot of depth in Africa. When I was working for the Pentagon on the future of China and Africa, I kind of discovered Africa, but I also discovered the nexus of Africa to the Middle East, and that is in the Red Sea. You look at Yemen, it's not just Yemen, but the Bab el-Mandeb actually borders Djibouti as well. So my question is, how do you get the specialists, you have all these wonderful specialists, say, who know Cameroon or Ethiopia, to also understand the implications of the Middle East conflict. If Iran were to get influence in Sudan, what would happen to the Red Sea? Could there be a war? So you could see new conflicts coming from the kind of merger of regional specialization. What do you do to encourage education of African specialists about the Middle East and vice versa?
So 2 things before I hand it over to Virginia and Francesca. First, you didn't discover Africa. It existed before you started working on it. I'm just horsing around, Jonathan. The second thing is, one of my favorite things about the International Institute for Strategic Studies is that we have country specialists, regional specialists, functional specialists, and we cross-pollinate our work so that we learn from each other. And one of the real challenges for those of us in the leadership is how to keep all the talented analysts in this organization excited about continuing creating opportunities. They're plenty excited. We need to create opportunities for them to continue to expand and deepen their skills and to have opportunities to grow the analytic richness exactly as you described. Yes, it's a challenge. It's a fabulous challenge. We're lucky to have it. Francesca, then Virginia. Or Virginia, go ahead.
Thank you. I think that's a very is an excellent question, and if you look at the program of the last Manama Dialogue, you'll see, which for those of you who are not familiar with, is this a security summit that the IISS has been running for multiple years in Bahrain, and focuses on the security of the Gulf and the Middle East. And we had both a plenary session and a small off-the-record session that looked exactly at these the dynamics at play in East Africa and the involvement of Gulf states in on the African continent. So we are very much interested and also monitoring how, for instance, the rivalries among Gulf states are playing out in different ways in a number of East African countries, and we do that by engaging in high-level discussions with senior officials, both from the African countries and also from Gulf states, but also from the point of view of our own research, and just talking about just very practical things. For instance, Eleanor Beaver, who works on East Africa, and I have been often had conversation with Emil Okaime, who was sitting next to you, our senior fellow for the Middle East, and we've been discussing how these things play out and how we can increase our work looking at analyzing these trends.
Other questions? In the way back.
I just wondered if it's a kind of applies to any conflict worldwide, but I'm particularly interested in the Sahel. If you could comment on the role of population dynamics. So in terms of population growth, age structure, where populations are distributed geographically, and if this is factored into your research, and if so, what have you found?
Yes, definitely.
Excellent question. Virginia?
Yes, thank you very much. Absolutely. We increasingly, especially within the broader conflict security and development program, we very much monitor demographic development and urbanization trends across the world. And the Sahel, of course, is one of those regions with very high levels of population growth. And there are in places like Niger and Mali and so on. Those are the places where women and the highest number of children in the world. There are also low levels of development and broader issues related to fragility. And we do monitor them in parallel with the monitoring of climate change and how that impacts conflict. So a growing number of people increase competition for already scarce resources that are becoming scarcer and scarcer. And indeed, with regard to the Mali Sahel conflict, we have been looking, for instance, at how desertification is having an impact on economic opportunities. Same, of course, goes for countries such as Nigeria, of course, the most populous country in the world. One of those examples often mentioned when we talk about the youth bulge in Africa. So certainly we monitor those developments.
And just to add one point about the youth bulge, it's very often just talked about in terms of the challenges that it presents for economic development and for drivers of conflicts. But at the same time, the youth bulge in Africa is creating a new dynamic, which is a generational demand for more representative politics. And we have seen this in many reiteration and in many in many situations in which the youth are spearheading demonstration and protest to hold the leaders more accountable. And this, of course, in a context in which leaders are less elastic to the demands of the population, has created new dynamics that then contribute to change the state of the game in a way. So we are going to see quite a few development along those lines, we believe, in the near future.
So what I'm going to do, I see 3 hands, and we have less than 10 minutes. So I'm going to take 1, 2, 3 questions, and then we will answer them in a slate. And any additional question? Okay, 4, because I saw 1 hand all the way in the back. Andrew, I'm not going to call on you because you get the opportunity to dust it up with these folks about this every day. But I will let you make a closing comment. Okay, we're going to take those 4. We're going to answer in tranche, and we're going to bring this to an end punctually at 10:30.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Hayley Davidson from Crisis Action. You talked a lot about illicit financial flows and criminality and how that's driving conflict. Do you have recommendations for what the international community should be doing more of to try and tackle that? And also, is there a role for the private sector, particularly looking at the international banking community and what they could be doing to crack down on that?
That's an outstanding question.
I wanted to ask about, come back to policy relevance, and on the basis that conflict prevention is usually easier and cheaper than conflict resolution. I understand your definitional points about what qualifies as an armed conflict and what doesn't, but I wonder if, have you thought that your analysis of factors and drivers of conflict should enable you to perhaps have an early warning chapter in this document to say, here is a place that doesn't meet our qualification as a conflict at the moment, but all the factors, the drivers are there, and on current trends, there's a high chance it will be in next year's publication.
What an excellent suggestion. 3rd question, yellow top up here up front.
To tag on to the previous comment on migration is particularly on your views on the changing role of the military, especially when we're talking about mass migration. So other than just normal kind of military rule of law enforcement stuff, do you see their involvement in any of the kind of softer activities such as reconstruction, development, because of course we can't have one without the other? Thank you.
Excellent. Last question, all the way in the back.
Sheila Stewart from the British Council. I just want to put together 2 points that were made. First of all, the point about we have the tools and we're not using them. And second, the point that's just been made about the youth bulge and the fact that it's generating a new dynamic. And we work a lot with young people, and what we see consistently is that this version of contentious politics is creating a new dynamic, but it's a conflictual dynamic, because one of the things that happens is that governments where there are conflictual politics are getting support from the international community to beef up their ability to use coercion to manage national security threats. And I think, yes, it could create a new positive dynamic, but if we don't shift the way we use these tools, it could create a negative dynamic where contentious politics, which are not abnormal or necessarily unhealthy, become conflictual because they're met with a very hard response.
Excellent point. Andrew, you don't get to ask a question, but if you have a point you want to make, now's the time to do it.
Just quickly to add to this discussion, one of the things I would definitely say from the Horn of Africa, in particular East and also Central, what we're seeing emerging is also the recruitment of, what I would say, the recruitment of more localized groups as well. So what you tend to find is that you have the traditional insurgency groups who are larger in function, be able to have heavy weapons, but what we are seeing is their ability to actually recruit localized youth and mobilize them really quickly, most times in the case of a week, to join rebel groups for attacks, for sort of counterinsurgency campaigns, and then quickly go back into communities as well. And I think that's one of the growing trends that we see in the analysis for this year.
Okay, Francesca.
Thank you. I'll start with the early warning system question. Also because I happened to work on a similar topic in the past when I was at the UN. And it's not easier today. It's maybe even more difficult to convince governments to invest in this type of approaches, simply because the reactions are very emergency driven, and so it's very little political capital and attention span is left to situations that could be prevented in advance. What I would say in that regard, with regards to the book, is that we probably don't want to have this book too many things, and so ending up not doing that too well. But that is certainly a part of research that could be developed in the program along those lines. I would simply not sort of confuse the two, because it's already a very big and dense piece of work, and trying to address too many topics within it might detract attention from what actually the book can provide in terms of analysis and information.
If I can just jump in on exactly that point, and I totally agree with that. But what we can do as part of broader research that we conduct as part of the Conflict Security and Development program, well, each of us within our regional, areas of regional expertise, keep an eye on the countries beyond the ones that we consider to be in conflict, so that we are ready whenever we believe that a situation has reached a conflict level to include it. And we would write articles and other forms of analysis that allow us to share that analysis on situations that haven't reached a conflict level yet.
So demonstrating the diversity of views in this institution, I disagree with my colleagues. I think we ought to have a chapter on here's what. So we'll be arguing about this as we shape next year's armed conflict survey. I also think I hear in a lot of the questions a reinforcement about geopolitical drivers being something that we should pay more attention to, and also the policy relevance and policy utility of the different available tools. So I appreciate those suggestions about how to think about the armed conflict survey going forward. I also want to tell you about 3 upcoming events here at Arundel House. Thursday, the 16th of May, exploring the links between slavery and conflict. Professor Kevin Bales is going to be talking. Andrew Chi chairing 3:30 to 4:30 on the 16th. On Friday, the 17th of May, from 4 to 5, Sudan's Long Walk to Democratic Transition, with Andrew as a speaker and Nina Pulls as a speaker, Virginia Comolli chairing that. And Friday, the 24th of May, the local turn-in peacekeeping, with Han Dorison as the speaker and Andrew Chi as the chair. That's 3 to 4 p.m. on the 24th of May. My friends, thank you for showing up this morning to help us launch the 2019 Armed Conflict Survey. Won't you join me in thanking Virginia Comolli and Francesca Grandi, the leadership of it, and all the people who contributed to it.